My name is Deirdre McBride, and my task this morning is to set the scene, to introduce the panel and to start the discussion. In September, I became a postgrad at the George Mitchell Institutes for Global Peace, Security and Justice here in Belfast. And my role there is researching commemoration and social memory in Northern Ireland, the use of heritage in remembering Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme in 2016. But from 2010, I was Director Cultural Diversity at the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council, developing the principles and the collaborative network with HLF that has underpinned the approach in Northern Ireland to what we call the Decade of Centenaries. And therefore we're delighted that the Museums Association accepted this as a workshop for the conference. The overall context for exploring a divided society, this workshop is based on the changes in the political landscape in Ireland 100 years ago, and that it is also, I think, predicated on the continuing peace process, in which we have a peace agreement that is underpinned by membership of the European Union. The presentations this morning, of which there are three, explore how approaches nationally and locally adopted and create space, how those approaches that were adopted created space in which politically difficult and challenging narratives can be embraced and multiple narratives were unpacked, and we can maybe talk about that further in discussion. But arguably the peace process has made this possible and more desirable to explore difficult history so as to promote greater understanding and the overall reconciliation within Northern Ireland and between the two parts of Ireland. Have we done this? How and what and with what impact? But let us think first about the context of the decade. In an Ireland of competing nationalisms, the 1916 Easter Rising became the foundational story of Ireland, while the sacrifice of the 36th Ulster Division on the 1st of July 1916 in the Battle of the Somme became Northern Ireland's foundational story and proof of its continuing union with Britain. So these are powerful stories and memories about the struggle for and against Home Rule, the First World War, Easter Rising, War of Independence, negotiations, partition and civil war. The social memories of the tumultuous years 1912 to 23 contribute to the divisions on and within the island. Those divisions are reflected in the two jurisdictions and how marking the centenaries was structured and envisaged in each. In Northern Ireland, following a positive statement in March 2012, just before the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Ulster Covenant by 500,000 people, the Northern Ireland Executive tasked two government departments, one led by a Sinn Féin minister and the other by a Democratic Unionist Party minister, to develop a centenaries programme. Instead, the Community Relations Council and Heritage Lottery Fund took the lead and adopted a set of principles for remembering in public space and supported a collaborative network of national and cultural organisations, academics, historians, NGOs, local councils and arts practitioners to explore the decade in a respectful way, to complicate our history and to place these centenary anniversaries in a broader political, social and economic context. And at this point I'll make a plug. There's a load of brochures that are 75 case studies of work in Northern Ireland at the front. Please take them home. In the Irish State's context, in the 26 counties, or as it's called Ireland, Maurice Manning, who was chair of the expert advisory group that was appointed by the Irish Taoiseach, spelled out two major imperatives. Firstly, that there would be public confidence in the impartiality and integrity of the commemorative programmes and events, and secondly, that the efforts would be inclusive of the various traditions that make up our national identity. We may want to discuss later to what extent and how were the commemorative programmes and events in the two jurisdictions inclusive, and indeed if there were any connections across this island in this decade of centenaries. These approaches were mindful of the fact that this is difficult history for us. Research by Margaret O'Callaghan, Mary E. Daly, Kevin Bean and others indicate how contemporary political concerns have in the past influenced the nature of the commemoration of the Easter Rising. Arguably, there was little appetite in the Republic for the 75th anniversary of the Easter Rising in 1991 because of the sensitivities provoked by the Northern Troubles. While plans to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Northern State in 1971 petered out in the context of deepening violence. Keith Jeffrey has suggested that the annual commemoration of the Battle of the Somme in Eastern and Unionist communities was a product of weakness and anxiety about the future. And perhaps it remains so. Indeed, Roisin Higgins, who we heard from this morning, suggested some of the key figures in the Easter 1916 Rising were members of a revolutionary generation who were politicised by the centenary commemoration of the 1798 rebellion of the United Irishmen. So the way in which a difficult history is marked or commemorated can influence both the past and the future. The last years of the decade contained particular challenges for us: civil war, mainly in the south, sectarian violence, mainly in the north, and 2 new parliaments. This year we remember the 50th anniversaries of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement. Then we have the Troubles, and inevitably the very painful and difficult anniversaries of over 3,000 deaths and 10 times that many injured. For example, just last week, 25 years after the Shankill bomb, the bombing of Grey Steel Pub, the shooting dead of 23 people in various locations were marked in local communities, often with sensitivity, but also with controversy. Professor John Brewer argues that the transformation of social memory, which is necessary in peace processes, and that the remembering of Irish history is a vital part of this. Social processes, he suggests, have 3 tiers: the state, civil society, and grassroots, and are more likely to succeed when policy issues are managed in a combination of the 3. It will be interesting to discuss how the 3 levels appear or were absent and how they can complement each other. If this is not difficult enough, we have Brexit. Back in 1912 to 23, there was no border. What today you may know as the hard border, the soft border, the Irish backstop, the Irish border, or the British border in Ireland is 301 miles long with 208 physical crossings, such as Brexit. It is also a very different Ireland, as these 2 infographics that I'm going to show you now suggest. And let's see if I can get this to work. And this one, these date from 2011 and were done, commissioned by Community Relations Council with an organisation called the Detail TV, and it was foreshadowing the call by UKIP for a referendum on which became Brexit, and the rise of the Scottish National Party, and also the rise of Sinn Féin in the Republic, as in the north. And this second one, she said, also came out, is also based on some census figures from around that time. And basically what it indicates is almost a complete reversal in terms of Northern Ireland of some of the demographics from the 1920s to today. But close up, these are very mixed populations scattered throughout Northern Ireland. And that other 7%, which is there today, is ethnic minority population, which has grown, and also a recognition of the size of the LGBT community. So I want to finish at that point and move on to introducing our first panellist, who is Lar Joyce. And Lar is Port Heritage Director at Dublin Port. Previously, he curated the award-winning Soldiers and Chiefs, the Irish Soldier at Home and Abroad from 1550 exhibition at the Collins Barracks, which is described as a museum with a museum. He played a key role in the decade of commemorations between 2012 and 2017, involved in a variety of projects and exhibitions. In 2016, he worked on the Moore Street and GPO projects and was historical advisor for On Post's 2016 commemorative stamp series. More recently, he's partnered with the theatre company Anu Productions on the plays Pals, The Irish Gallipoli, Sunder and These Rooms. He's a graduate of University College Dublin, Leicester University and the Getty Leadership Institute, California, and is currently chairman of the Irish National Committee of the Blue Shield and a member of the Board of Directors of the Irish Museums Association and the Military Heritage of Ireland Trust. So I welcome Lar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre, and thank you very much for the introduction. Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to look at some aspects of commemoration over the last couple of years in the Republic of Ireland, or as we would normally say, the South. What I want to look over in those kind of 10 minutes is commemorating 1912 to 22 in Ireland museums, and also broader afield. Our National Library did some wonderful work. Then I want to look at the decade of commemorations, and then complicating the narrative. It was important, as Deirdre made reference there, to the academic committee that was established, that we complicated the narrative and we didn't have a black and white version of history during this period from 2012 to 2022. And then looking forward, we're only at the halfway point, and we're now going to look at the War of Independence and the Irish Civil War, and looking at sources and the challenges that we will face over the next couple of years, and then a short conclusion. So when we look at the decade of commemorations, it's important to remember that the Irish people from 1914 to 23 endured 10 years of intense military activity. World War I, an urban insurrection in 1916, a guerrilla war, and finally a very bitter civil war. The result was a new nation bearing the hope, and both the hopes of many of its citizens and the pain left by the wars that had brought it into being. The crucial event of Ireland's 10-year ordeal was the Easter Rising. A relatively small but determined group of Irish men and women took the opportunity offered by Britain's conflict with Germany to strike a blow for Irish independence. The newly proclaimed Irish Republic was quickly and brutally suppressed, but the memory of the heroism depicted here in this image and the executions that followed changed Irish history forever. Therefore, the commemorations of 1912 to 22 in Ireland focused on 1916, the 1916 Rising until the last 20 years. It was a very simple story to tell. It was about a six-day revolution. The more complicated stories of Irish participation in World War I, the very violent War of Independence, and the regrettable Civil War were largely ignored throughout the 20th century. And there was this focus on the six-day revolution that was the 1916 Rising. And these are some images of the 1930s that kind of indicate what was happening during this period. There's very much, as I say, this focus on just those 6 days. And the National Museum at that stage was involved in putting on a very interesting contemporary exhibition about 1916, which it did right throughout the 20th century. Things changed in the 1980s when the role of 200 Irish men and women who served in the British Army in World War I were discussed. In 1998, the Peace Tower was opened in Belgium by the Queen and the President of Ireland. And in 2006, a 2,000 square metre exhibition opened at the National Museum of Ireland dealing with Ireland's complicated military history. The 1916 story was there and is central to the story, but no longer dominated that central story. And the museum had been doing this since the 1990s. And as I say, this was great change that occurred in the 1980s. And these are some of the images from the Soldiers and Chiefs exhibition. So we're talking about World War I, the participation of Irish men in World War I, and also looking at 1916 in the same room, something that probably could not have been done in the 70s or 80s. During the decade of commemorations from 2012 to 22, the government organised a political committee of politicians, but also an academic committee, which Deirdre made reference to. And it's been a very well organised commemoration. Each year, a programme of events is organised. Publications have been arranged, and it's been in many ways marketed quite beautifully. There's been a focus on the role of the military, but in Ireland, the military is a very small force of 9,000 and is well known for its UN participation. But there has been, in many ways, probably an overly too much focus on the role of the army at various events. There's also been very close relationships with the British government, shared events, in this case an image of Prince William and our then Taoiseach at Messines Ridge in 2017, some commemorations in the bottom. There has been one controversy when a protest happened in Grange Gorman in 2016, and the Canadian ambassador is intervening there with the protester and taking him out. That's about the only way to put it. Going back to the National Museum, throughout the period from 2012, it's been heavily involved in various parts of that commemoration with the Asgard exhibition, which was in the Irish history, a very important moment of gun smuggling in 1914. That ship has been preserved and now is on display, while the lockout, which was a mass strike that occurred in 1913, was also commemorated at the museum. We also looked at more detail into different aspects of World War I that complemented our other exhibitions, but in particular focused on the role of the Irish in Gallipoli in Turkey, where Lenny Irishmen, about 30,000 of them, fought in 1915. And then in 2016, we did our largest exhibition ever on the 1916 Rising, but again looked at that more complicated story of Irish participation on both sides in the 1916 Rising. about 1,000 Irishmen were serving with the British forces and were involved in fighting against, in many ways, their brothers and colleagues from previous lives. In many ways, we can look at 1916, the 1916 Rising as a small civil war that occurred at that stage. The National Library did some interesting work with a brand new exhibition, The Road to War, but also did continuous lectures and seminars throughout the 4 years, and also did a wonderful photographic exhibition about 1916, the War of Independence. Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin party, which, as Deirdre has said now, is involved in both parliaments, North and South, organised or was involved with the Revolution 1916 exhibition, which opened for 6 months in 2016 and reflected a more stronger Republican approach to the story of the 1916 Rising. While at national level, a new museum was built inside the General Post Office, which was the headquarters for the rebels during the 1916 Rising and which had been destroyed on the last day of the Rising, rebuilt in the 1920s and reinstated as a post office. But for 2016, a museum was almost dropped into the centre court of the post office and tells the story of the events of the Rising in the GPO over those 6 days. One interesting approach taken by An Post and also happens in Belfast is the painting of post boxes back to being red as they would have been in 1916. After independence, the post boxes were kept. It was too expensive to replace them with new post boxes, and they were simply painted green. And that was the way the new state approached in many of its institutions and in a new world. And as a new country, it didn't have the funding to change things quite dramatically and simply painted things and moved on. One controversy was an attempt to create a memorial and exhibition and museum at Moore Street, which sadly and regrettably ended up in a very complicated High Court case, which is still ongoing. This was an attempt to create a preserved streetscape of what had happened at the end of the Rising when the Padraig Pearse had surrendered, but ended up in a very hotly debated High Court case. Complicating the narrative, one thing that we did at the National Museum during this period was to work with the new productions, a wonderful group of actors and directors and producers, and Louise Lowe will be here tomorrow giving a talk, and I would encourage you to go to it. The projects that we worked with them with PALS, the Irish of Gallipoli, one moving moment at the end of the play, after 45 minutes experiencing what is going to happen to these soldiers, we go back to the day they left Dublin, and we take these photographs. The audience are encouraged to take these photographs, wave them goodbye. But at this stage, we fully know, as they're clapping and laughing, what's going to happen to them once they go out to Gallipoli, which was a horrific experience for them. We also worked with the new and with the Imperial War Museum at the Battle of the Somme film, with the National Concert Hall and an orchestra to bring the story of the film, the battle, and the theatre into the National Concert Hall. And this is kind of carried on with Sunder and also These Rooms, which have now both won a lot of theatre awards. And These Rooms was involved or reenacted again at the London Theatre Festival this year in June. Looking further afield, our colleagues in Cavan have done a wonderful project, a series of projects. Sabina Donoghue and her colleagues and her team rebuilt the GPO at the County Museum in Cavan to bring that story to their local communities, but also rebuilt a 350-metre replica of a trench system there, and again brings both the GPO, that story of the Republican Irish fighting during the 1916 Rising, but also those men who served with the Irish regiments in World War I with the British Army. And that's a perfectly wet day. Looking forward and looking at the sources and challenges, the Irish Wars from 1919 to 23 will be a challenging period to commemorate. It's a very violent period in our history. It's a well-documented period. Many historians feel it's probably the most overly documented and recorded and written about revolutionary period ever. This is really because there are a large number of sources. The pension files of the 17,000 people involved have now been preserved, scanned, and released on militaryarchives.ie website, which allows historians and film people interested in this period to find out more what happened. And we'll find more details at that website. However, one of the big challenges is the emotive nature of the Civil War. This is a photograph taken in October 1921 of a politician, Kevin O'Higgins, and his wife Bridget getting married. He's in the centre of the photograph. To his right is Eamon De Valera, a friend, but his best man is Rory O'Connor to his right. Rory O'Connor and Kevin went to school together. And less than a year after this photograph was taken, Kevin Higgins was to sign his death warrant and have his best friend executed as retaliation for attacks on government forces during the Civil War. Eamon de Valera was to go on the run throughout the Civil War and later on become a politician and lead the Fianna Fáil party into power in 1932. Kevin Higgins himself was to be shot by a lone gunman outside his local church on the way to church on a Sunday in 1927. So in many ways, this image summarises the complexity of our Civil War. It also kind of shows you the personal nature. We talk about brother against brother, and it very, very much was so. So this will be a great challenge as we go into that period. So thank you very much.
I'd like to introduce Helen O'Carroll, who's going to give the next presentation. Helen is a native of Tralee, County Kerry, and a graduate of University College Dublin. She holds an MA in History and a Diploma in Arts Administration. She's been involved in heritage projects in Kerry for over 25 years and has been curator of the Kerry County Museum since 2000. In 2016, she produced Casement in Kerry, A Revolutionary Journey, a major exhibition which was officially opened by President Michael D. Higgins on the 21st of April 2016. Helen, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Are we okay? Thanks. Early on Good Friday morning, 1916, Roger Casement, along with two companions, was put ashore on Bannostrand, County Kerry, from a German submarine. It was one of the few significant events connected to the Easter Rising to happen outside of Dublin, which gave Kerry a degree of distinction in this part of the national story. And it's something that we've never, ever, ever let anyone ever forget. We have monuments, statues, and plaques in his honour. We've named an archaeological site, a school, and a train station after him. We've even started to mine his tourist potential. And now we have a major exhibition in Kerry County Museum. And all of this, despite the fact that the man was in the county for only about 32 hours. Yes, it seems a bit excessive, doesn't it? A bit self-aggrandizing. I mean, Casement's is a global and a national story, one that could be told in the many other parts of the world where he lived for significant periods of time. Africa, South America, the United States, Northern Ireland, London, Berlin. I mean, this was a man who witnessed the scramble for Africa in the latter part of the 19th century, who exposed human rights abuses in the Congo and in the Amazon, who toured America raising funds for the Irish volunteers, who was sent as an emissary to Germany at the height of World War I to enlist aid for the Irish cause, and who ended up in the gallows of Pentonville Prison in London. So the Kerry episode is really a mere footnote in all of this, a tiny local story in the great drama of Casement's life. But situated as it is in the intersection between the global, the national, and the local, it provides a perspective that is not available in all the other many parts of the world in which he lived. It takes us beyond the monuments, statues, and plaques to a far more nuanced story, one that is uniquely ours to tell. Now, if any single object can be said to draw all of this together, it is the boat that brought Casement ashore on that Good Friday morning, and which is at the centre of our exhibition. In Ireland, Casement's landing on Bannostrand in the boat came to be seen as part of a doomed but heroic effort to bring the German guns for the Rising, upon which any hope of Irish military success depended. In Ireland, he was perceived as a martyr in the nationalist cause, hanged by a vengeful John Bull, ensuring that he would be numbered amongst the patriot dead. But in Britain, Casement was hanged not as an Irish rebel, but as a traitor who'd gone over to the enemy, and the enemy was Germany, not Ireland. In this context, the boat took on a different symbolic meaning. Regarded as a trophy of war, it was quickly dispatched from Kerry to England, where it was presented to George V by the Royal Irish Constabulary to mark their success in capturing the arch-traitor, Roger Casement. In turn, the king presented it to the Imperial War Museum to be included in its displays in Crystal Palace in 1920, underlining Casement's status as a traitor, not an Irish rebel. So this little boat is the vessel that propelled Casement into history as a traitor on one side of the Irish Sea and as an Irish patriot on the other. And it had exactly the same effect on the people in Kerry who had stumbled across the evidence of his landing, but it took them in an opposite direction. These were ordinary people going about their daily business when they encountered Casement. They had no idea who he was, where he'd come from, or the significance of what they'd seen and found. But within 2 weeks, they'd been subpoenaed to give evidence and whisked off to London for his trial and not allowed to return home for 2 months until it finished at the end of June. They were pawns in a much bigger game, and they had a propaganda value as Irish loyalists supporting the Crown by helping to convict a traitor, and they're seen here numbered 1 to 5, along with the other prosecution witnesses, mainly police and army personnel, in a celebratory photograph of the successful team outside the Royal Courts of Justice after the trial. But back at home, public opinion had been transformed in the wake of the rising, and they returned to a hostile homecoming when they were finally allowed to leave London. They were now regarded as traitors who had helped to put the noose around Casement's neck, traitors who had betrayed the nationalist cause. Their lives were never the same again, and their story is uniquely intertwined with Casement's trial and execution. But it's a story that remained largely untold for nearly a century, hidden behind half-truths, distortions, name-calling, whispers and taboos. Casement killers and casement hangers were just some of the epithets that were hurled at the witnesses and their families, even down to the next 2 generations. As one of their descendants put it to me, they were shamed in their own community. But that shaming was itself driven by a wider sense of guilt in Kerry that no one had come to Casement's rescue, that local nationalists had failed to act decisively and spring him from custody, that ultimately in Kerry he'd been abandoned to his fate. Once that story comes into view, you can see the excessive memorialising of Casement in Kerry for what it is, an overcompensation to hide the sense of shame and guilt. A man who embodied several paradoxes in his life, Casement left behind him a complex legacy in many parts of the world, including Kerry, where he cast a long shadow despite the shortness of his stay. So the exhibition provided the opportunity to throw a light on that shadow, to create a space where people could unfurl personal and family memories alongside the historical evidence, allowing memory to meet history and to recover a coherent sense of what actually happened, rather than face another century of bits and pieces of the truth. I think we're all aware that that meeting of memory and history will be even more difficult in the next phase of commemorations for all sorts of reasons. And the one we're least looking forward to in Kerry is the last part, the Civil War. Kerry was the site of some of the worst atrocities during the conflict, atrocities that are often depicted as the settling of local scores. But it's not really a local story. Several of these massacres were perpetrated by the newly formed National Army of the Irish Free State, something that the state never adequately acknowledged or took responsibility for, because that appalling savagery went right to the heart of the issue of the legitimacy of the new state and the authority and integrity of its army. That silence fanned the flames of bitterness on the other side, which glossed over its own part in the violence to give a very one-sided narrative of the Civil War in Kerry that has endured right down to today. For the keepers of this flame, history is constructed from a sense of grievance that has never been assuaged, and it generates an unshakable certainty as to who were the heroes and who were the villains, who were the patriots and who were the traitors. But as more historical sources become available, hidden stories, large and small, inevitably will emerge to challenge the silence on one side and the certainty of the other. And the museum is, again, committed to creating a space where those stories can come into view. And difficult though this will be, the building itself has the capacity to provide some badly needed wider context. Completed in 1928, it was built as the seat of local government, one of the first and one of the very few new public buildings erected in the country after the foundation of the state. The money to build it came from the British government in compensation for the destruction of the old county hall by the Black and Tans during the War of Independence. But rather than rebuilding on the original site, the local authority chose to site the new building in the domain of the Denny estate, landlords of the town since the Elizabethan plantation in the 16th century. This was a deliberate statement in stone of the transfer of power to the new independent state. And finally, after the Civil War, it was where both sides of the divide, winners and losers, had to sit down together and participate in the running of a self-governing democracy, the achievement of which, in the end, was what all the fighting had been about. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Our next panellist I'd like to welcome is Paul Mullen. Paul Mullen is the head of Northern Ireland for the Heritage Lottery Fund and has been involved in a number of heritage, tourism and conservation projects over many years. Prior to working in the Heritage Lottery Fund, he worked with the National Trust and worked on the first World Heritage site management plan for the Giant's Causeway. He's a student both at Queen's University, Trinity College Dublin and Ulster University, where he's currently studying for his PhD in Heritage in a Divided Society. He's a current member of the Arts Council for Northern Ireland and a chair of the Decade of Centenaries Round Table here in Northern Ireland. He's also a member of the Irish Government's Expert Advisory Committee on the National Inventory of Intangible Culture and Heritage. I'd like to welcome Paul. Thank you.
Morning all. Let's see. Okay, I shall be speaking about the evolution of HLF's engagement with heritage in a divided society since 2006, and in particular around HLF and the Community Relation Council's joint working during the recent and ongoing Decade of Centenaries. I've got to do that in 10 minutes. Right. In 2007, the Heritage Lottery Fund organised a conference in Belfast, Digging Deeper, with the British Museum's Neil McGregor in the starring role. 11 years on, I could give you a word-for-word account of his presentation, but I won't, at least today. This conference signalled HLF's willingness to engage with heritage and identity, and in particular with the challenges that identity poses in a divided society. Namely, that the past can mean many different things to different people. These different views on the past are often shaped more by memory than by history. So it was for HLF as a funder to develop an approach that would enable communities to explore their past and what their heritage meant for them without further deepening division. But we also believed that having a better understanding of that past had to be of benefit for Northern Ireland society as a whole. An example. The Diamond War Memorial occupies a central position in Derry. It had been physically attacked by nationalists on a regular basis, as it was perceived as telling a story, that of a Unionist memorial commemorating Unionist First World War deaths. This was nothing to do with Derry nationalists. However, research uncovered something very different, a shared history commemorating the deaths of a near equal number of Catholics and Protestants, a memory that had been lost within that nationalist community. That fact transformed the site from one identified as exclusively Unionist Protestant heritage to one which was shared space, where meaning was open to different perspectives. This project brings up the distinction between history and memory in interesting ways, a theme that runs through the whole decade. It is a fantastic example of how engaging and difficult heritage can achieve so much, In particular, it shows what can be gained by changing the narrative. In Northern Ireland, commemoration is not benign. It brings you immediately into identity politics. The period in question, 1912 to 23, contained key events that still have great significance today in Irish life and politics. The Third Home Rule Bill and the reaction to it, the First World War, the Easter Rising, the War of Independence from Britain, partition and civil war. This presentation describes HLF's collaboration with the Community Relations Council over the last 8 years. 1916. Here we have images of the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme, events which fed into very differing narratives and which are seen as providing the foundation myths for nationalist and unionist memory, and which are at the heart of the divisions within Northern Ireland society still today. The commemoration of both these events represented both the challenge and opportunity in a divided society like Northern Ireland. The Taoiseach in 2010 set the tone for the whole of the island. He saw it as a decade of opportunity where the separate histories, British and Irish, Orange and Green, Republican, Nationalist, Unionist and Loyalist, could be explored, and for the process of commemoration to recognise the totality of history of the period and all of the diversity it encompasses. The French thinker Paul Ricoeur would describe this as a narrative hospitality, something that seems lacking in the Brexit debate, the ability to recognise and respect other people's stories. However, I would make reference to a key distinction between north and south of the island. In the north, these events are primarily about history. In the south, these events are primarily about history rather than memory. Whereas in the north, we seem to live our past on a daily basis, with the events of 100 years ago still at the heart of contemporary debate. This is an image from a Loyalist area in Belfast. Here, history and memory allied and become corrupted as history is put into contemporary use. In this image, two distinct memorials become one. Through those commemorated here, the heroism of the First World War is linked to the darker times of the recent Troubles. The purpose seems to legitimise the connection between a contemporary paramilitary group, the Ulster Volunteer Force, a group who took their name from the earlier UVF, who were formed in 1912 in resistance to Home Rule, and who provided the bulk of Unionist First World War stories. So the image of the left identifies the names of people from the First World War, and on the right, some more contemporary individuals. I could present many images across the divide where community memory overcomes a shared historical understanding. It's not just on the Loyalist side, the Republican side here are equally complicit. This was a challenge to anyone engaging in commemoration throughout this period. That challenge was at the heart of CRC's and HLF's working together. In 2011, a conference, Remembering the Future, kicked our joint working off. A wider reference group of interested parties was also drawn together. The objective was to support constructive commemoration. This was not about controlling commemoration. We did not want to tell communities how to commemorate, but we could support efforts towards constructive commemoration. To facilitate this work, oh dear, this shouldn't happen. I'm not going to lie. To facilitate this work, a set of principles was developed. All groups engaging in the decade were encouraged to use them. The Northern Ireland Executive, Belfast City Council, and many others adapted them for their own use. And this approach can be summarised as building on ethics and evidence. So the principles that you can see there are to start from the historical facts. It's amazing whenever you deal with memory, how facts simply sort of escape reality. Recognise the implications and consequences of what happened, understand that different perceptions and interpretations exist, and show how events and activities can deepen understanding of the past. Another key approach, this is the Ulster Museum, was the role of public spaces. The galleries in the Ulster Museum have been important in setting the context for commemoration and have been fully utilised by communities. The galleries create an evidence space, facts again, a space where myths can be challenged and memory reconstructed from the evidence. As well as the Ulster Museum, the Public Records Office, libraries and local museums have enabled groups to draw on them as a resource. Other information and resources was available, some of which you've got down here, so please do take them. We don't want to be taking them back to the office afterwards. Research has shown the importance of stimulating ideas for what can be done at a local level. Who to go to for support in developing programs, lectures and events, where to go for research, how to develop research skills. Conferences and resource fairs were also organised. Now I'd like to look at a couple of projects that showed how all of this played out. This was a single identity project, training loyalist bandsmen to become tour guides. This project was developed in response to the decade. Within the paramilitary landscape, UDA areas, there are two paramilitary groups, particularly within the loyalist community, UDA and sort of UVF. UDA areas have less affinity to the First World War, the dominant theme for the decade for Unionists. The First World War is seen as being primarily of UVF interest. So this group's exploration of its past looked into the deeper past, where they discovered Sandy Row's role in the building of Belfast. This approach opened up the band to wider perspectives, helped them to challenge existing, more inward thinking, and think differently about where they came from. They moved from seeing themselves as victims of the past to actors in their community's future. The results have been impressive in terms of building self-esteem, creating jobs, and participating in wider initiatives. You had 15 guys who started off who were unemployed, 13 of which now are employed in some aspect of tourism. Here we can see how history can challenge memory in very positive ways. Here we have a nationalist single identity project about recovering the stories of nationalists and the Great War, a heritage ignored for 90 years. The consequences of the Easter Rising and the history of Northern Ireland from 1921 and the British Army's role during the Troubles had wiped the story of the involvement of Irish Catholics in the war from their community narrative. Here we had ex-Republican activists rediscovering their own families' connections with the British Army. This group were also at the heart of the Messine Association, which brings ex-paramilitary groups from both sides together. Sitting in a room with loyalist activists and ex-Republican activists debating about the future is quite a fascinating and interesting experience, and does show how far we've moved on in Northern Ireland. Recovering history to reshape memory has been at the heart of the Decade of Centenary stories. So what have we learned? Heritage has a unique power to engage communities. That's something that's at the heart of HLF's work, and it's at the heart of all museums' work. And that's why conferences like this, I think, are so important, because museums and the work that the likes of HLF does is there to open up to communities and to people the real value of heritage and connecting them with the present and future. An ethical and evidence-based approach allows communities to engage with difficult and challenging heritage. That's our great learning about this. Communities that thought that past was too difficult, they can engage with it in an appropriate way. Museums and libraries are a remarkable and core resource in this regard, and need to be resourced to do that work. What has worked in a divided society like Northern Ireland can benefit the UK in a post-Brexit context where identity politics hangs over us. I think we've learned quite a lot. And in conclusion from me, and this is something that comes up quite a lot, and it's come up a lot this morning, it's about complicating the narrative, opening yourself to these plural ways of thinking, exploring multiple narratives, narratives which are international. No event is solely local. It connects into something wider and much more globally significant. What's the role of women and families? What's the shared experience in all of this? So opening up thinking to multiple perspectives is fundamentally important. Putting yourselves in the shoes of others. I find, I must say, reading the German philosopher Hannah Arendt incredibly important in this regard, and particularly in terms of the modern day. But a key element is also building challenge and debate into the process. One of the great learnings, particularly through art events that have been held in relation to the Decade of Centenaries and plays, has been the debate afterwards. And that's where minds truly engage with some of these critical themes. And that way you can start to bring out the interconnectedness of these narratives. In Northern Ireland, we started off with monolithic identities on either side of the divide, which didn't seem to touch each other. Yet that's the real opportunity in heritage work, is to show how these stories actually are entwined. They cannot separate each other out from that. And that's the power of the work that's been done through the decade of centenaries. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, one final. Oops, I should have said, if you want to read, there's more detail. Book published, that was published yesterday. Routledge, Heritage in the Divide, Heritage After Conflict, 2018, Maguire and Crook. I have a chapter in it on all of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, Lar and Helen. And I'm going to ask, I suppose, as I've heard really rich material that has looked at, I think, very complex stories and very complex themes, both in Northern Ireland and Ireland, it also strikes me that while those themes and stories are linked, they're not cemented in the same time and in the same way in each jurisdiction. And I've a lot of questions running through my head, but I suppose the main one is having reflected on each other's presentations and obviously on your own work, what is it you think that in the last period covering the decade that we've not covered, that gets left out? And is that important, particularly as we think about the challenges ahead? Because we were all, I think, very conscious that by taking an approach to the decade, we were sort of leading towards something in the future and trying to negotiate very difficult history. So my question is around, what do you think got left out? Is that important? And what relevance is that in terms of us tackling difficult issues, or these difficult issues as we go forward? Helen, maybe you first.
Well, I think when we discuss this, I think actually it's probably something Lara is probably better able to tease out, in that it was the 1918 Conscription Crisis which didn't really get the airing in the Republic that it probably should have gotten. I think probably because by this year everyone is just bloody well commemorated out, and we want to take a break for a year or two before we go and do some more of the hard stuff. But I don't know, Lara, do you want to talk about that?
We're about to go into a period with the War of Independence where it's very much the myth of the War of Independence is battles and shootings and fighting, but the reality is most people, 30% of all casualties were shot by shotguns. So it's a very personal type of battle, but it's heavily romanticized in song and in books. What was interesting about this year, and I think Helen's right, that maybe it's the same people have been doing that, carrying the commemorations since 2012, that everyone needed a break. But 1918 is an important moment in Irish history because there's an attempt to introduce conscription in Ireland, and in many ways the whole of society joins together to protest against it. And what you get is a mass movement in a society against violence. And the irony, of course, is that within a year we'll be involved in a war of independence. So there was, I think, a missed opportunity to do what we did in 2016 and actually encourage people to come out on the streets and remember that there was a moment in 1918 where there was a mass movement against the war, World War I, and there was this moment where people like Eamon de Valera, who's now president, or then president of Sinn Féin, suddenly was talking to the Roman Catholic Church, who were then talking to other political parties. People on the Labour movement side were all singing with one voice. So there was that kind of missed opportunity, I think, in 2018. But Helen is right. I think it's... And you had and you on the 7th of June. But the point I'm making is that it should have been on the same scale as we did in 2015 and 2016. I would have liked to have seen O'Connell Street closed down, and I think it needed a scale. There was some nice work done, and I was involved in some of the projects, but it was very much at a very small level, and I feel it needs to be taken at a national level.
Thank you. Paul?
I'd just focus on something that is yet to happen and needs to happen and should not be left out, and that is what people tend to forget is that the United Kingdom as we know it now started with partition. There was no United Kingdom in the current context prior to that, because the whole of Ireland was part it was Great Britain and Ireland. And that plays so heavily into the whole sort of Brexit debate. And the Brexit debate seems to have forgotten about that aspect until it came up and started to bite people in the whole sort of debate now about the Irish border. And in terms of how all of that plays into identity and plays into the debates about who we are as a society, that's incredibly, incredibly important. And we need to see, I think, greater engagement right across the whole of the UK in that understanding and in that discussion.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question and then open it up to the floor. And my question is around, to what degree do you think those three aspects of the state, civil society, museums, etc., and were active, and what was the level of participation from the grassroots and from the public? Lar? Sorry.
Sure. I think with, in particular, 2016, there was huge participation. A lot of the other commemoration events, though, weren't well attended. And I have a fear, having two young daughters, that when, after a while, the various events that you went to, it was the same people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and you wonder how much the messaging that Paul was talking about, and they are trying to explain how complicated it is, that seeping into a younger generation. And I think that's part of the challenges. And my own 12-year-old daughter took her takeaway from the commemorations in 2016 was that the English were very bad, which wasn't what was being explained, but that was her takeaway. And it's a takeaway of a shy and innocent 12-year-old, but that was her takeaway. And we won't really see the impact of these commemorations, this first part, and how it's impacted on the under 25s until 2025.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, I think the government made such a huge effort with 2016, and there was so many different, all the local authorities were involved, the Department of Education, I mean the schools were driven daft, doing 1916 projects and all of that, and so it really did generate that excitement for various different events that were happening and so on, but and people could get around, it was much, in some ways, a simpler story. It's going to be very difficult to see how that's going to happen with the next bit, which, as someone said to me, is all the killy shooty bit, and what do you do with that? There aren't, that will be difficult, but I think it really did work for 2016, but it took a huge effort. And I don't know if you can sustain that level of effort over the next, however, God knows how many years we've left in this.
Thank you. Paul?
I think things in Northern Ireland were quite different. There was a lack of state engagement, except for various memorial events around the First World War. And really, success for us, if I can define it this way, was the fact that events which we thought had the potential to spill over to violence actually weren't violent at all, and that we saw a greater sense of understanding, a kind of deepening of narratives in both communities. But you're not talking in Northern Ireland about mass participation in any way, but more slow but sure learning that needs to continue on, and we need to ensure that learning continues, because we are not out of the woods yet, given that we're sort of working towards the years up to the years of where partition came into place, and that poses just a massive challenge for the society.
Yes, thank you. And the troubles after that. Any questions from the floor? There was a lady at the back standing beside the person with the mic, or sitting beside, yeah. And then there's someone about 3 or 5.
Yeah, thank you. More an observation than a question. I'm Linda McKenna. I work at Down County Museum in Downpatrick. My concern, and I've worked in the museum for a long time, I've been involved in peace projects. I have a couple of concerns. One is that one of the things that we seem to have been doing over the past number of years in looking at commemorating these various events is we've pushed people into designating themselves nationalist, unionist. We've implied that everybody in the whole of Ireland at that time was caught up in a Home Rule crisis, the First World War, 1916 rebellion, conscription crisis. The majority of people were not. They were obviously impacted by these things, but they actually were trying to live their normal, everyday, ordinary lives during this time. Commemoration by asking people to actually, look at these things. I'm not saying we shouldn't, of course we should. We've been encouraging people to say the nationalist experience was, the unionist experience was, by the way, nationalists were also involved in World War I, unionists were also involved in conscription crisis, but we're still designating people as being nationalist, unionist, and asking them in a way to take a side that it didn't actually take at the time, perhaps. I think in a way we've been actually encouraging the retrospective interpretation of history. That wasn't the case at the time by a lot of these commemorations. So I think there's a big issue there in us actually, encouraging the labeling of people. And I think that's something that we need to be very, very careful about. The majority of people at this period were trying to live an everyday life in very difficult circumstances. Do you understand what I mean? So I think that museums have a responsibility to actually say, yes, these things were happening, they impacted everybody in different ways, people had different attitudes to things, but by and large, people were not, obsessing with whether they were nationalist or unionist. And they certainly weren't obsessing with how things would be commemorated in the future. And I do think that we have contributed to the labelling of people again and again and again. We haven't been looking at things like what was everyday life like during at this period. I come from North County Dublin, and certainly in 1918 in North County Dublin, that people were far more exercised about the ongoing strike among agricultural labourers, which was impacting their daily lives all the time. They were in effect locked out for longer than they had been in 1913. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes,
yeah. So I'm very concerned about that. I think it's a real issue at that, And as you say, in 20 years' time, what will we have done to actually keep people thinking about themselves as being either nationalist or unionist?
Thank you. I'll take a couple of other questions, comments, and then go back to the panel. There was someone, a lady 3 rows back, with her hand up, or 4 rows back. And is there anybody over the other side of the room? Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Sandra Stankler from Historic England. I had the good fortune to visit the Easter Rising exhibition in Dublin in 2016, and my takeaway was that the English were very bad too, so I have sympathy with your daughter. However, I suppose I was really intrigued by the principles that the last speaker talked about, and the use of facts to dispel long-held beliefs, which may be based on memory, but which may be inaccurate. To what degree do you think that you have been successful in challenging those long-held beliefs and changing people's mind?
Thank you. One last question, and I'll put it over to the panel. Anyone? No? Okay. I suppose 2 questions. One is around, I suppose, the stories of ordinary life. Does that get lost in these big pictures, and are we inadvertently feeding into that? And the second one around, I suppose, the principles in particular, but this issue about facts and dispelling long-held myths. Paul, and then Lar.
I think the first sort of point mentioned there about too great a focus on nationalists and unionists. I think you're absolutely right. That's what we've got to ensure that is avoided. Part of our work has been in Northern Ireland is in terms of recognising that communities were going to remember in whatever way they wanted, but to provide resources to try and encourage them to think more broadly and encourage them to think in very different ways, to challenge some of those particular stereotypical narratives amongst sort of nationalists and unionists. And so a lot of our resources would have gone towards that. And we've always got to be conscious of that. We've got to ensure that, and I think museums have been very good at this, trying to come up with different stories that don't simply fall into those sloppy narratives. In terms of the second point about sort of facts, we had quite a few historians were involved in pulling together those set of principles, and the words of facts were debated quite, can we use such a term as facts? But the general feeling was that term was good because people understood it. And while one can debate, about facts and their interpretation, by getting people to focus more on the evidence. That was what was to be achieved out of all of this. Looking at evidence, bringing out the evidence, and ensuring that those public institutions that had an opportunity to do that would do that well.
Before I bring Laura in, there's a gentleman here with a question.
Stephen Snoddy, director of the New York Gallery, Walsall. I was brought up in Belfast in the 1970s. I went to school in Lisburn. I went to Quaker school. I come from a Quaker family. My question is that the great work that you've done gives different narratives, and there's an interconnection, as you say, between loyalism, unionism, republicanism, and nationalism. Those lessons that have been learnt, are they feeding back into the educational system? Because I paraphrase in that Catholic schools taught Irish history, Protestant schools taught British history. I was lucky, I went to a school that treated the whole of history, and I learned British history and Irish history. So have the lessons that have been learned and the history that's been revealed feeding its way into the young people of Northern Ireland and the young people of Ireland through education.
Thank you. I'll come back to your question, and Laura, and then Helen, and then I'll come back to your question. This is quite specific. Yeah.
Just in relation to the other questions, I agree with you about the duty of museums to explain that in many cases in relation to our own revolution, it's only about, as I said, mentioned in the talk, 17,000 people, men and women, were involved. Life goes on, and we try to do that in the exhibitions that we had at the National Museum. It is a very small group. 200,000 Irish men and women served with the British Army, a larger figure, which is, as I say, largely forgotten for the 20th century. So it is important to explain that this is a cadre of revolutionaries, a small group that leads to such great change through 16 and through the War of Independence. In relation to facts and myths, that's part of the challenges within the 1916 exhibition. We do talk about the fact that many of the responding British Army soldiers are Irish. The Irish soldiers were involved in the executions of the leaders. So these are uncomfortable truths, but they are talked about in the exhibition. It's essential that we do that. And if you don't mind, I just respond to the third question. It's a key one. My 12-year-old is now 13, and she's going into secondary school, and she doesn't have to do history anymore. They've just introduced a new ruling that she doesn't have to do history under the junior cert, which is the equivalent to the O-levels. So in a way, her very exciting 2016, when they did everything about 1916, could be her last grasp with our complicated history. She's decided to do history herself this year. But she could at any stage opt out of that class, and historians in Dublin are making, and around Ireland are making a big case that history should really be mandatory up to the age of 16, so that we can explain our history, because there isn't proper civics courses. So in many ways, to understand how complicated it is north and south in our schools in the south, we rely heavily on our history teachers to tell that complicated story.
Helen?
Yeah, just on that last point, I can't speak about Northern Ireland, but I think, there's such a dissonance in the last few years between, the government is so supportive of the commemorations and all of that, while at the same time taking history off the curriculum for secondary schools. It doesn't add up, and particularly as we face into the next few years and with all the problems with Brexit. So I think you're right to raise that question. About the slotting people into the different categories and all the rest of it. What I would like to do in our exhibition that will come up for the Civil War is to put a bicycle at the centre of the exhibition, because rather than a gun, because a lot of the sources that we use, and Lara's right to say that it is very well sourced period of history, but a lot of those sources are about the people that were involved in terms of shooting and killing and all that sort of stuff, and carrying dispatches. But what are really interesting, and they are now becoming more available, are the financial compensation files, where ordinary people sued for compensation because their property was destroyed, or the retaliations were performed, and all this sort of stuff. But one of the biggest things is they're looking for compensation for the theft of a bike. So you have on the one hand the people running around shooting and killing people on their bicycles, but those bicycles are stolen from ordinary people who are going, okay lads, whatever, you might want to live and fight and die for Ireland, but I want my bloody bike, and I want the money for my bloody bike because it's important to me. And it just goes to show that that all of that ordinary life was going on. Even as I mentioned, the massacres in Kerry happened about, I think in total, something like 25 men were killed in horrible, blown up, horrible explosions. But in that same month, there was, just about a week after, there was a compensation case where the people were suing for compensation because their cowshed had been burnt down, and it was burnt down by boys and girls who had liked to dance in this shed, but the people who owned the shed locked it so they couldn't get into it to continue their dancing. So the dancing boys and girls burnt the shed down. And it just goes to show you that you're right, that things like that happen all the time, and it's not just the shooty-killy stuff that goes on. And I think that will be very important for us in the next phase of it as well. Whether we have convinced anyone with evidence, I don't know. That's really, I think, you can only put the evidence out there and say to people where you've got it from, and just you can't make people's minds up for them. You know, if they want to make up their mind about this is a fact or an alternative fact, you know, your bit is to put the evidence out there, I think.
I'll bring Paul in and then I'll conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, and just very briefly, I'm from a Northern Ireland perspective, the whole educational side. Clearly, not enough is done. Schools can opt out of certain aspects of our history, and given the challenges that we have and moving towards how we view Europe and whatever, we need much more understanding so that people can make and be informed for the future. That's fundamental.
And I just add to that, it is patchy, and some excellent projects, Coromila, Nerve Centre, and there's been some amazing graphic novels that have been delivered, you know, with 2 stories back to front on the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme, and delivered into every primary school in Northern Ireland. But it's still the case that schools, in a sense, will choose which parts of the curriculum to do, whether they'll do, you know, modern Irish history or they'll do the Holocaust, and that'll break down to a degree on maintained schools and controlled schools. I'm sorry we've gone over time. I hope that hasn't had an adverse effect. But thank you all for coming this morning, and thank you to Paul, Lar and Helen for excellent presentations.